As Manchester mourns and the British military steps in to help with security, we turn now to what the attack says about the capabilities of terrorist groups. For that, I'm joined by Michael Leiter. He was a director of the National Counterterrorism Center from 2007 to 2011 during both the George W. Bush and Obama administrations, and Alexander Meleagrou-Hitchens, research director of the program on extremism at the George Washington University. Michael Leiter, I want to start with you. The British intelligence agencies seem a little concerned that the name of the bomber was leaked by U.S. officials hours before British authorities made that public. Is that significant?
I think it is, Hari. As an investigator, you really don't want to release information until you have a purpose in doing so. And as the British were clearly investigating other elements of this attack, or at least trying to determine whether there were additional people involved or potential follow-on attacks, it makes good sense that those investigators might want to keep that name behind the green curtain until they found use in disclosing it. So it's unfortunate that information was disclosed, but unfortunately in this era of 24-hour news, keeping these investigations classified is obviously a challenge on both sides of the Atlantic.
Alexander Meleagrou-Hitchens, you've studied jihadist groups in the UK and elsewhere. Are you surprised by this?
Unfortunately not. This kind of thing has been coming for some time. I suppose the main surprise is the scale of it. We had the Westminster attack just recently. Only 4 or 5 people were killed there. So we considered this to be the kind of what to expect in the UK. Was not in mainland Europe. The access to sort of criminal networks was not quite as easy as it was in mainland Europe. But unfortunately, the scale is, I think, the surprise. The fact that it's happened, not at all, because unfortunately, we've been making arrests in the UK for a long, long time, stopping plots like this repeatedly. You can't stop them all.
Well, Michael Leiter, as Alexander just mentioned, just 2 months ago, there was a stabbing attack that we all witnessed, or the aftermath that we witnessed on TV. Is there a pattern here that seems to have escalated from that to this?
Well, I think there's clearly a pattern for ISIS throughout Western Europe, and that pattern is quite different from what we saw in the late 2000s from al-Qaeda. And I would really identify 3 significant changes for ISIS that are manifesting themselves again in all of Western Europe and the UK. First, there's a pace and scale of radicalization that we really have not seen before, largely through the effective use of the internet. Second, the operational approach of ISIS is so very different. Rather than large-scale attacks, they are actively pursuing and pushing people to stay where they are and attack in their homes. And third, the volume is simply overwhelming for security services, whether it's the MI5 in the UK or the FBI here in the United States. The volume of threats that they have to face is making their jobs very difficult, and they simply can't stay on an individual target indefinitely, and that makes them make some very difficult choices, and unfortunately sometimes those choices end up not being the right ones.
Alexander Meleagrou-Hitchens, if you had to do a word association game with the word Manchester, most U.S. Citizens would probably say the football club. How did it get to be a hotbed for terrorist recruitment?
Well, the area that it appears the attacker Abadi came from is part of southern Manchester that is actually very near a real hub of radicalization in the UK called Moss Side. It's essentially an area, sort of deprived area, a lot of gang activity. And what we've seen is a sort of morphing of sort of a gang culture into a jihadist culture, at least a fusing of those 2 cultures. And so essentially we've actually seen about 16 British individuals involved in some form of terrorist activity for IS coming from pretty much a 3-mile radius. So whether or not this is relevant to the current investigation into Abadi is not yet clear, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw that he was somehow influenced by that wider network.
Well, Michael Leiter, today the Prime Minister escalated the threat level from severe to critical. That means it had been severe for so long. But unfortunately, even in the attacks surrounding Paris, we saw one of the attacks were outside a football stadium. Are these sorts of attacks almost indefensible?
To some extent, very regrettably, they are. Counterterrorism officials can detect and disrupt some plots, and often defenses can be used to at least minimize what sort of casualties we have. But as we saw in this attack, as we saw in the attack in Turkey at the airport, as we saw in Brussels, the terrorists know where we have security measures, whether that's airport screening or metal detectors entering the stadium. And it's not all that difficult to adjust your tactics. So you can still find large collections of individuals just outside those security perimeters. Now you can push those security perimeters out some, but ultimately we live in open democratic societies that are not constantly policed. So in that sense, there will always be these soft targets, and security can only move us so far. A lot of this is going to come down to not just intelligence and defense, but engagement in these communities where we do have potential hotspots for radicalization.
Alexander, I want to ask you about that engagement in these communities. How does this happen that a British citizen, even if he's from Libyan descent, grows up there eating fish and chips like everybody else? Well, what lures him into this ideology?
Well, one of the sort of cliches, but it is largely true about that question, or the answer to that question, is that every path to radicalization is unique. Everyone has unique experiences that leads them to this kind of action. But there are some overarching issues. You mentioned he was a British citizen. He's the son of, he's a second generation British. And that is the most common target for radicalizers and recruiters, because these guys, generally they're growing up in Britain. They have a different culture to their parents. They don't relate to their parents. They particularly don't relate to the version of Islam their parents ascribe to. So they go out looking for a version that speaks to them, not culturally infused, say in Libya or Pakistan or Bangladesh, one that speaks to them, one that talks about geopolitics, one that involves their day-to-day experiences. And unfortunately, jihadist, sort of ideology and that jihadist version of Islam can sometimes look like the version these guys are looking for. It speaks to their day-to-day experiences.
All right, Alexander, Meleagrou-Hitchens, Michael Leiter, thank you both.
Thank you, Ari.